The lavish mansion glittered under the soft, golden lights of the grand chandelier, the hum of elite conversations filling the air. Mark adjusted his tie nervously as he stood among the wealthy guests, the rich aroma of expensive wine swirling around him. He knew this crowd wasn't his usual place. These were the kind of people who could ruin him with a word, the kind of people who never forgave mistakes. Everything was perfect, except for one thing: his wife, Susan. She didn't fit in here, not with her simple dress, her awkward smiles, or the way she constantly fidgeted with the edge of her clutch. She wasn't like the elegant women around her, draped in luxury, gliding through the room with practiced grace. And Mark knew his friends, those powerful business associates, would notice. They always did. They'd pick her apart with their subtle glances and whispered comments. As they approached him, he could feel their eyes darting toward her, waiting for an introduction. His heart raced. "Mark, who's this?" one of his closest friends asked, a sly smile playing on his lips. For a split second, Mark hesitated. His mind raced, thinking of all the ways this moment could go wrong, imagining the judgment, the whispers after the party, the slow loss of respect. And in that moment, the fear of being seen as less successful, less polished than the rest, took over. "Oh, her." He forced a smile, pretending as though it wasn't a big deal. "She's just my housekeeper. She helps me out with things at home." The words were like poison in his mouth, but he couldn't stop them. His friends exchanged glances, smirking knowingly, their respect for him intact, or so he thought. But beside him, he felt Susan stiffen. He didn't need to look at her to know her expression had changed. The hurt was obvious, almost palpable. He had just humiliated her in front of everyone, reduced her to nothing more than a servant. The evening dragged on, but the tension was impossible to shake. Every time someone glanced at Susan, Mark's stomach twisted. He'd chosen to betray her trust to save face. But now, with every passing minute, the weight of that choice began to suffocate him. As the night wore on, Mark's carefully constructed image began to crack, and the consequences of his decision were far from over. Mark felt his stomach churn as the car drove towards the grand mansion of Henry Coleman, his old friend. Susan, his wife, was at his side, nervously adjusting her dress. It had been a day full of tensions between them. The awkwardness between them was palpable. For Mark, tonight was crucial. He knew that at this party, there would be the most powerful businessmen in the city, people who could define his future, open doors, and consolidate his reputation in the elite circle. For Susan, it was an opportunity to be by his side, to support him, even though she knew that Mark had left her out of his professional life for a long time. The arrival at the party was grand. The mansion was imposing. The lights shone brightly on the driveway, and the guests, elegantly dressed, were already crowding at the entrance. Mark got out of the car first and, for a second, hesitated before shaking Susan's hand. His thoughts were spinning like a whirlwind. Despite his love, an inexplicable shame invaded him every time he saw her interact with his world. How will they see her? What will they say about me? He thought with increasing anxiety. As he entered, greetings and approving glances began to arrive. "Mark, how long?" "It's a pleasure to see you, dear friend," the voices echoed. But when eyes fell on Susan, an awkward silence settled in. She, with her serene beauty and simple dress, contrasted with the high society women who filled the place, wrapped in luxury. Mark could notice the inquisitive glances, and, in his mind, murmurs began to take shape. What is she doing here? She doesn't fit in? How can he be with her? He imagined. Finally, the critical moment arrived. Henry Coleman, the host, approached accompanied by several friends, all multimillionaires, and asked with a subtle but mischievous smile, "Mark, tell us, who is this charming woman?" Mark felt the heat rise to his face. The words stuck in his throat. The silence in the group was deafening, and every second that passed seemed like an eternity. In his mind, he debated between being honest and saying, "She's my wife," or making something up so as not to look bad in front of them, with a tight smile. And before he knew it, the words came out of his mouth like poison. "She's my employee." A nervous laugh accompanied the sentence, trying to take the weight off what he had just said. but the damage was done. Mark felt a lump in his chest as Susan looked at him in disbelief. Her eyes, which until that moment reflected support and understanding, were now full of surprise and pain. The betrayal had been clear and public, and although Mark had felt relief at first upon noticing the smiles of his friends, that relief soon turned into deep pain. Susan, with dignity, said nothing at that moment, but her look said more than 1,000 words, and Mark knew it. Mark felt a cold sweat forming on his brow as he watched Susan's expression falter. The elegant ballroom, filled with laughter, music, and clinking glasses, suddenly felt suffocating. The chandeliers above seemed to burn brighter as his heart pounded. He had crossed a line, and he knew it, but he couldn't bring himself to face it yet. Henry Coleman's group, pleased with Mark's introduction, burst into laughter, exchanging glances that showed both amusement and condescension. They found it humorous that Mark would bring an employee to such a prestigious event. One of them, a tall, silver-haired man named Richard, nudged Henry with a grin. Quite bold, bringing the help to a place like this, Mark. But then again, you always had your own sense of style. Mark forced a smile, playing along as though it were all a clever joke. He felt trapped by his own words, by the pressure of fitting into this world where appearances meant everything. Inside, however, his stomach churned. He glanced at Susan, standing silently beside him, her eyes still fixed on him with a look that cut deeper than any insult he could have imagined. Her lips were tightly pressed together, her hands clenching and unclenching the delicate fabric of her dress. She wasn't just hurt. She was crushed. For a fleeting moment, Mark considered reaching out to her, taking her hand, and confessing the truth. "This is my wife, my partner, the woman I love." But his cowardice overruled his conscience. He feared what the truth might cost him in this room full of power brokers. He needed their approval, their connections. Admitting the truth could ruin everything he'd worked for. The night dragged on, but the weight of Mark's betrayal hung heavily between him and Susan. He could feel her presence beside him, stiff and distant, as they mingled through the crowd. Every laugh he forced, every conversation he engaged in, was haunted by the silence between them. At one point, they found themselves standing near the massive windows that looked out onto the estate's expansive gardens. The night sky was dotted with stars, the world outside peaceful and calm, while inside, Mark felt like he was drowning. Susan stood a few feet away from him, staring out into the darkness, her back to him. The distance between them had never felt so great. Just as Mark was about to speak, desperately searching for words that might bridge the growing chasm between them, Henry reappeared, accompanied by more of their so-called friends. "Mark," he called, jovially slapping him on the back. "You've been holding out on us. How long have you had this beauty working for you? And tell us, what exactly does she do?" The group chuckled, the question playful but loaded with mockery. Henry, always the charming manipulator, was testing Mark. He wanted to see just how far Mark was willing to go to maintain the facade he had so foolishly created. Mark felt the pressure build. His mouth went dry. His hands trembled slightly as he held his glass of champagne. Mark stammered, glancing at Susan, hoping, praying she would somehow save him from this situation. But she remained silent, her back still to him, gazing out into the night. The crowd's laughter died down, waiting for his response. "She manages household affairs," Mark finally muttered, the words barely escaping his throat. His shame was palpable, but he forced a smile, hoping it would pass unnoticed. Another round of laughter erupted. Richard, leaning closer, whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Household affairs, eh? Lucky man. I didn't know your household required such personal attention." The room filled with knowing smirks and more laughter. The insult wasn't just directed at Susan. It was a jab at Mark's own character. He was no longer just a man trying to fit in. He was a joke. And yet, he laughed along, pretending to be unfazed. But Susan had had enough. Quietly, she turned away from the window and walked towards the door, her movements slow, deliberate, almost regal in their restraint. Mark noticed too late, his heart dropping when he realized she was leaving. "Excuse me," he said quickly, pushing past the man and following her into the hallway. The music faded behind them, leaving only the sound of their footsteps echoing in the vast corridor. "Susan," he called, reaching out to touch her arm. She stopped but didn't turn to face him. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. "Susan, please let me explain." She remained still for a moment before slowly turning her head. Her eyes, once soft and full of love, now glistened with unshed tears. "Explain what, Mark?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Mark's chest tighten. "That you're ashamed of me. That I embarrass you in front of your friends." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had no defense. What could he say to undo the pain he had caused? "I stood by you through everything," Susan continued, her voice growing stronger. "I believed in you when no one else did. I supported you. I loved you. And tonight, you threw all of that away because you were too afraid of what these people would think of you." Mark felt a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to apologize, to beg for her forgiveness, but the weight of his guilt kept him silent. He had betrayed the one person who had always stood by him, and no amount of apologies could erase that. Tears finally spilled down Susan's cheeks as she shook her head, stepping back from him. "You didn't just lie to them, Mark. You lied to me. You've been lying to yourself." Before Mark could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the dimly lit hallway. The sounds of the party carried on without them, but for Mark, the night was over. He had lost Susan, and he knew it. Mark stood frozen in the hallway, watching Susan disappear down the corridor. The echo of her heels, tapping against the marble floor, was the only sound that filled the silence between them. He wanted to chase after her, to beg her to come back, but something inside him, his pride, his shame, kept him rooted to the spot. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the night, every lie he had told, every look of disappointment on Susan's face. The doors to the ballroom remained slightly ajar, and from inside, he could hear the laughter and chatter of his so-called friends. They didn't care about him. They didn't care about Susan. To them, he was nothing more than a source of amusement, a pawn in their social games. Mark clenched his fists. How could he have been so blind, so weak? He had sacrificed the one person who truly loved him for the approval of people who didn't even matter. And now he had lost her. He knew Susan wouldn't forgive him easily, if ever. The look in her eyes as she left had been one of finality. But as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, something shifted inside Mark. He wasn't going to let it end like this. He couldn't. He had to fight for her, for their relationship, for everything they had built together. It didn't matter how deep the wound was. He would find a way to heal it. Without thinking, Mark stormed back into the ballroom. His eyes scanned the room, searching for Henry and the others. He spotted them near the bar, still laughing, completely unaware of the damage they had caused. His pulse quickened, anger boiling inside him. "Henry!" Mark called, striding over to the group. The laughter faded as they turned to face him, their smug expressions faltering as they saw the intensity in his eyes. "Mark, what's the—" Henry began, but Mark cut him off. "I'm done with your games," Mark said, his voice cold and steady. "I've let you and everyone here manipulate me, but it ends now. Susan is not my employee. She is not someone to be mocked or used for your entertainment. She's my wife, and she deserves better than this, better than me." The room fell silent as Mark's words hung in the air. Henry exchanged a glance with Richard, clearly surprised by Mark's sudden outburst. "I'm ashamed of myself," Mark continued, his voice rising. "Ashamed that I let your opinions and your status mean more to me than the woman I love. But that ends tonight. I don't care what any of you think of me. I don't need your approval anymore." Henry smirked, but it was weaker this time, less confident. "Mark, come on. We were just joking around." Mark shook his head. "No, you weren't. You wanted to tear me down, and you succeeded. But I'm not going to stay down, and I'm sure as hell not going to let you or anyone else disrespect Susan." With that, Mark turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the stunned group of men. His heart raced as he stepped into the night, the cool air hitting his face like a slap of reality. He had said his piece, but it wasn't enough. He needed to find Susan. He found her outside, sitting on a stone bench near the garden. Her back was to him, and her shoulders were hunched, but he could tell she was still crying. Slowly, cautiously, he approached her, his footsteps soft against the gravel. "Susan!" Mark's voice was hoarse, filled with regret. She didn't turn around, but he could see her tense up at the sound of his voice. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the stillness of the night heavy with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered, kneeling down beside her. "I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that I love you. I always have. I was afraid. Afraid of losing everything I'd worked for. Afraid of losing their respect. But none of that matters anymore. You're the only thing that matters." Susan finally turned to face him, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the soft glow of the garden lights. Her eyes, though filled with pain, held a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of forgiveness. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I can just forget what happened tonight. You lied to me. You lied to them. You made me feel like I was nothing." Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. I know I can't take it back, but I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again. I don't care about the business, about the money, about any of it. I just want you." For a long moment, Susan said nothing. She just stared at him, her emotions swirling behind her eyes. Finally, she sighed, pulling her hand away from his. "I don't know if things can ever go back to the way they were, Mark," she said softly. "But I'm willing to try. Just don't ever lie to me again." Mark's heart soared at her words. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. And right now, that was all he needed. He stood up and offered her his hand. "Let's go home." Susan hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand in his. Together, they walked back toward the car, leaving behind the party, the lies, and the past. Mark knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. As Mark and Susan walked toward the car, the tension between them still lingered in the cool night air. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mark knew that trust wasn't something you could simply fix with words, and Susan's silence weighed heavily on him. He could feel her uncertainty, her hesitation in every step, but she was still here, still walking beside him, and that was enough for now. As they reached the parking lot, Mark opened the car door for her. Susan glanced at him briefly, her face unreadable, before sliding into the passenger seat. Mark circled around to the driver's side, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could possibly repair the damage he'd done. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but nothing felt right. Words felt so empty now. The drive home was quiet, with only the soft hum of the engine filling the space between them. The city lights flickered past the windows, but neither of them paid attention. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He stole glances at Susan, hoping for a sign, a clue as to what she was feeling, but her gaze was fixed outside, lost in her own thoughts. Finally, as they neared their house, Mark couldn't take it anymore. "Susan," he said, his voice soft but urgent, "I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to make this right." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes remained focused on the passing buildings, her expression distant. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it's not that simple, Mark. You hurt me in front of everyone we know. You made me feel small, like I didn't matter." Mark swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of her words hit him. "I know. I can't undo what I did, but I swear to you, I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it." The car pulled into their driveway, and for a moment neither of them moved. The silence between them was suffocating, filled with the echoes of everything left unsaid. Susan turned to face him, her eyes finally meeting his. "Mark, I need time. I need to figure out if I can trust you again. Tonight was a lot." "I'll give you all the time you need," Mark said quickly, desperation lacing his voice. "But I won't give up on us. I love you, Susan. I know I haven't shown it the way I should, but I do." Susan sighed deeply, her hand resting on the door handle. "Love isn't just words, Mark. It's actions. And tonight your actions told me something very different." With that, she opened the door and stepped out, leaving Mark sitting alone in the car, staring after her as she walked up to the house. His heart ached with regret, but he knew she was right. Love wasn't just words. He had to prove himself, not just to Susan, but to himself. The next morning, Mark woke up to an empty bed. Susan had slept in the guest room, and the emptiness beside him felt like a cold reminder of everything that had gone wrong. He sat up, rubbing his face, and took a deep breath. Today was the day he would start fixing things. No more excuses, no more lies. He had to show Susan that he was serious about making amends. After getting dressed, Mark went downstairs, where he found Susan sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hands. She didn't look up when he entered, but the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. "Susan," Mark began carefully, walking over to the table. "I know you're still upset, and I don't blame you, but I was thinking, maybe we could spend the day together? Just us. We could talk, really talk. No distractions, no interruptions." Susan finally looked up, her eyes guarded. "Mark, I don't know if I'm ready for that yet." Mark felt his heart sink, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I understand, but I want to show you that I'm committed to making this right. Please, just give me a chance." There was a long pause before Susan sighed, setting her cup down. "All right, one day. But don't expect everything to magically be okay, Mark." "I don't," Mark said quickly. "I just want a chance to make things better." Later that afternoon, Mark and Susan found themselves walking through the park near their home. The weather was warm, the sun shining down through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the path. It was quiet, peaceful, but the tension between them remained. They walked side by side, but the distance between them felt like miles. Mark cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about last night, about everything I've done." Susan kept her gaze forward, her expression neutral. And I realized that I've been living my life, trying to impress people who don't actually care about me. I've been so focused on what others think, on fitting in with them, that I lost sight of what really matters." Susan glanced at him briefly. "And what do you think matters now, Mark?" "You," he said softly. "Us. I was a fool to put their opinions above our relationship. I see that now. I just hope it's not too late to fix things." For the first time, Susan's expression softened, though only slightly. "It's going to take more than words, Mark. You've said things like this before, but your actions haven't matched up." "I know," Mark admitted, "but I'm willing to change. I'm willing to prove to you that I can be better." They walked in silence for a few more minutes, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under their feet. Finally, Susan stopped, turning to face him. "Mark, I want to believe you. I really do. But I'm scared that things will go back to the way they were." "They won't," Mark said firmly. "I promise you they won't." Susan studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for something, some sign of sincerity, of real change. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "All right, Mark, I'm willing to try, but this is your last chance. If you mess up again, I'm gone." Mark nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and determination. "I won't let you down, Susan. I swear." As they resumed their walk, Mark felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a real chance at making things right. As they continued walking through the park, the tension between Mark and Susan seemed to lift slightly. The quiet of the trees and the soft rustling of leaves provided a momentary escape from the turmoil in their relationship. Mark was determined to prove to Susan that he could change, that he could be the man she deserved. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but seeing even a hint of hope in her eyes gave him the strength to keep going. They sat down on a bench by the pond, the water shimmering in the sunlight. For a moment, They both watched a family of ducks swimming nearby, neither speaking. Mark could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, but he didn't want to rush it. He didn't want to push her too hard. Finally, Susan broke the silence. "You know, Mark," she began, her voice soft but steady. "It wasn't just last night. It's been building for a long time. Every little thing you've done to put others ahead of me. Every time you've made me feel like I wasn't enough, it's all just piled up. Last night was the breaking point." Mark nodded slowly, his chest tight with guilt. "I know. I've been selfish, focused on the wrong things. I thought that being successful, being accepted by people who don't really matter, would make me happy. But I was wrong. I took you for granted, and I'm so sorry for that." Susan looked away, her eyes distant as she stared at the water. "I don't know if you can fix it, Mark. I don't even know if I can trust you again, but I don't want to walk away just yet." Her words hit him like a wave, a mix of hope and sadness. He had been so close to losing her, and now there was a small chance, just a small chance, that he could make things right. But her hesitation was still there, and Mark knew he had to earn her trust back. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," Mark said carefully. "I know it's going to take time, but I want you to know that I'm going to do whatever it takes to be the man you need me to be." Susan gave him a long, searching look, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. After a moment, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "We'll see, Mark. Words are one thing, but actions are what matter." Over the next few weeks, Mark did everything he could to prove to Susan that he was serious about changing. He started spending more time with her, making sure she knew she was his priority. He took her out on small dates, just the two of them, trying to rebuild their connection. One evening, as they sat together at a cozy restaurant, Susan looked at him with a softer expression than she had in a long time. "I've noticed you've been trying," she said quietly. "And I appreciate it, Mark. I do. But it still feels like something's missing." Mark's heart sank a little. He had been hoping to hear that things were getting better, that he was on the right track. "What do you mean?" Susan took a deep breath, glancing down at her hands before meeting his eyes again. "You're trying, but it feels like you're doing it because you don't want to lose me, not because you really understand what went wrong in the first place." Her words stung, but Mark knew there was truth in them. He had been so focused on not losing her that he hadn't fully addressed the underlying issues. I guess I've been afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of losing you, afraid of being alone. But I think you're right. I need to take a step back and really figure out why I let things get this bad in the first place." Susan nodded, her expression softening a little. "That's what I need, Mark. I need to see that you're not just trying to fix this for me, but that you're trying to fix yourself too." Mark took her hand gently, squeezing it. "I promise, Susan. I'll figure it out. I'll become a better man for both of us." As the weeks passed, Mark made a conscious effort to focus not just on Susan, but on himself. He started seeing a therapist, trying to unpack his need for validation from others, his fear of failure, and his deep-seated insecurities. It wasn't easy. Facing his own flaws head-on was one of the hardest things he'd ever done, but he knew it was necessary. Susan, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines, slowly beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, Mark was truly changing. She could see the effort he was putting into himself, into their relationship. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but for the first time in a long time, Susan felt a glimmer of hope. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Susan turned to Mark with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she began, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about us, and I think I'm ready to start rebuilding, but it's going to take time." Mark felt a surge of relief. "I'm ready for that, Susan. I'll wait as long as it takes." Months later, the anniversary of the party that had almost torn them apart arrived. This time, Mark and Susan found themselves at another gathering, but the atmosphere was different. Mark had changed, and Susan could see it. He no longer cared about impressing people who didn't matter. He was confident in himself and in their relationship, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like a real team. As they stood together at the party, Susan looked up at Mark with a smile. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "You've really changed." Mark smiled back, wrapping his arm around her waist. "I couldn't have done it without you." Susan leaned into him, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. They had been through hell and back, but they had come out stronger on the other side. As they walked through the crowd, Mark no longer felt the need to impress anyone. All that mattered was the woman by his side, the woman he had almost lost but had fought to win back. And for the first time, he knew without a doubt that he was exactly where he belonged. As time passed, Mark and Susan's relationship continued to heal, but it wasn't without its challenges. The nights of calm were often followed by days where old wounds reopened and tension simmered beneath the surface. Still, Mark was committed to making things work, and Susan, though cautious, began to trust him more with each passing day. However, the weight of Mark's past mistakes still loomed over them. The party where he had introduced Susan as his employee haunted both of them in different ways. For Mark, it was a symbol of his own deep insecurity and fear of rejection. For Susan, it was a reminder of how easily he had betrayed her for the approval of people who didn't matter. It wasn't until an invitation to another prestigious event arrived in the mail that these unresolved issues were thrust back into the spotlight. The invitation was from one of Mark's most influential clients, a high-profile socialite who was hosting an extravagant charity gala. It was an opportunity for Mark to network and potentially close several lucrative deals, but the moment Susan saw the invitation, her heart sank. Memories of that humiliating night came flooding back. The whispers, the stares, and the way Mark had so easily cast her aside. She stared at the gold-embossed card, her fingers trembling slightly. Are you going to go?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though the tension in her voice betrayed her. Mark hesitated, sensing the weight of her question. "I don't know," he said carefully. "I want to, but I don't want to drag you back into that world. Not after everything." Susan nodded, appreciating his honesty, but it didn't ease the knot forming in her chest. She set the invitation down and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that again." Mark moved closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "We don't have to go, Susan. I'm serious. I'm not the same person I was back then. I don't care what they think anymore." Susan turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "But do you really mean that, Mark? Or are you just saying it because you think it's what I want to hear?" Mark's heart clenched at the question. He wanted to believe he had changed, that the opinions of those snobbish elites no longer mattered to him. But the truth was, a small part of him still craved their approval. He was terrified of admitting it to Susan, but he knew he couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. "I'm still working on it," he confessed, his voice low. "I don't know if I'll ever stop caring completely about what people think. But what I do know is that you matter to me more than they ever will. And if going to that gala is going to hurt you, then I'd rather not go." Susan's expression softened, and for the first time since the invitation had arrived, she smiled. It wasn't a full smile, but it was enough to reassure Mark that they were on the right path. A week passed, and the day of the gala approached. Despite their earlier conversation, Mark found himself torn. This was a major opportunity for his career, and part of him worried that not attending would send the wrong message. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that going without Susan's full support would only set them back in their progress. The night before the event, Susan approached him as he was getting ready for bed. "Mark," she began, her tone serious, "I've been thinking about the gala." He turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What about it?" She took a deep breath, her eyes steady. "I think we should go." Mark blinked, surprised. "Are you sure?" "You don't have to do this for me, Susan. I don't want you to feel pressured." Susan shook her head. "It's not about pressure. It's about moving forward. We can't keep avoiding these things forever. And honestly, I want to see how much you've really changed. Not just in private, but in public." Her words struck a chord with Mark. He realized that this was more than just a test for him. It was a chance for both of them to confront their past and face their future together. The night of the gala arrived, and Mark and Susan walked into the grand ballroom, arm in arm. The air was filled with the soft hum of classical music and the clinking of champagne glasses. The elite of the city were dressed in their finest, and for a moment, Mark felt a familiar pang of anxiety. He glanced at Susan, but instead of the strained expression he expected, she looked calm, composed. As they made their way through the crowd, whispers followed them. Mark could feel the eyes of his former associates and clients lingering on him and Susan, but unlike the last time, he didn't feel the same need to impress or explain himself. At one point, one of Mark's old acquaintances, a wealthy entrepreneur named Peter, approached them with a smug grin. "Mark, it's been a while. And who is this lovely lady?" he asked, his tone dripping with insincerity. Mark felt a flicker of the old panic rising in his chest, but he quickly pushed it down. He glanced at Susan, who was watching him intently, waiting for his response. "This is my wife, Susan," Mark said, his voice steady, "and I'm incredibly lucky to have her by my side." Peter's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Well, isn't that wonderful? It's always nice to see a man proud of his partner." Mark didn't miss the condescending tone, but he didn't care. For the first time, he felt free from the judgment of people like Peter. He smiled warmly at Susan, who returned his smile with one of her own. As the night went on, Mark and Susan navigated the gala with grace. The stares and whispers still followed them, but they no longer mattered. Mark knew that the only opinion he cared about was standing right next to him. Later that night, as they drove home, Susan turned to Mark, her eyes shining with pride. "You did good tonight," she said softly. Mark smiled, a weight lifting off his chest. "We did good," he corrected, reaching for her hand. Susan squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and love. They had faced their fears together, and though there would always be challenges ahead, they knew they were stronger for it. As the car pulled up to their home, Mark leaned over and kissed Susan gently on the cheek. "Thank you for believing in me," he whispered. Susan smiled, leaning into him. "Thank you for proving that I was right." With that, they stepped out of the car and walked into their home, ready to face whatever came next together. As the weeks passed after the gala, Mark and Susan's relationship grew even stronger. The event had been a pivotal moment, not just for Mark but for both of them. They had confronted the past head-on, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the weight of their shared history had finally begun to lift. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, a soft rain tapping against the windows, Susan turned to Mark with a look of quiet reflection. "I never thought we'd get here," she said, her voice soft but steady. "After everything that happened, I wasn't sure we'd make it." Mark squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with emotion. "I wasn't sure either, but I'm glad we didn't give up. I'm glad you didn't give up on me." Susan smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you, Mark, for changing, for standing up for us, for being the man I always knew you could be." Mark pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm just lucky I had you by my side." They sat like that for a while, the sound of the rain and their steady breathing filling the room. For once, there was no tension, no lingering doubts or unspoken fears, just peace. Several months later, another invitation arrived in the mail, this time for a smaller, more intimate gathering with close friends. It was a dinner party hosted by a couple they had grown close to, and while it wasn't the same high-pressure environment as the gala, it still felt significant. Mark glanced at the invitation, then at Susan. "What do you think?" he asked, a playful smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Susan laughed lightly. "I think we've handled worse." The night of the dinner, as they walked hand in hand into the cozy, warmly lit home of their friends, Mark felt a sense of calm wash over him. The stares and judgment of the elite no longer held any power over him. He had learned that his worth wasn't tied to their approval, but to the love and respect he shared with Susan. At the dinner, there were no awkward introductions, no need to explain or justify. They were simply Mark and Susan, two people who had weathered the storms of life together and come out stronger on the other side. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. As they drove home later that night, Susan rested her head on Mark's shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "You know," she said softly, "I think we've finally found our balance." Mark smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "Yeah, I think so too." They drove in comfortable silence, the road stretching out before them, full of promise and possibility. The struggles they had faced together had only deepened their bond, and now they were ready to face whatever the future held. As they pulled into the driveway, Mark turned to Susan with a grin. "How about we make a promise to each other?" Susan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of promise?" "That no matter what, we'll always face things together. No more secrets, no more hiding. Just us against the world." Susan smiled, her heart swelling with love. "I can agree to that." They sealed their promise with a kiss, knowing that while life would never be perfect, they were stronger now than they had ever been before. As the camera slowly zooms out, the story of Mark and Susan comes to a close, leaving the audience with a sense of hope and satisfaction. The narrator's voice gently fills the air. Life isn't always easy, and sometimes we hurt the people we love the most. But if there's one thing this story shows us, it's that redemption is always possible, as long as we're willing to face our mistakes and fight for the ones we care about. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more powerful and heartwarming stories like this one. And remember, love isn't about being perfect. It's about standing by each other through the imperfections. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next video.